Welcome aboard Victorian train travel, where steam-powered dreams and danger rode in every carriage. The air was thick with coal dust, mystery, and the murmurs of strangers who might not be what they seem. Carriages rattled, brakes screeched, and timetables were more suggestion than promise. In this world, the journey was thrilling, but survival was never guaranteed. If the thought of thundering engines, untested brakes, and a single bolt standing between you and oblivion sends you peacefully to sleep, go ahead and hit like and subscribe. Drop a comment with where you're listening from and what ungodly hour the steam and soot found you. There's comfort in knowing we're all boarding the same midnight express to madness. Now dim the lights, get cosy, and let's slip into a world where speed was thrilling. Danger rode in first class, and somehow, people called it progress. You arrive at the platform wearing your best coat, clutching a satchel that contains everything you own, which is mostly socks and anxiety. Around you, steam hisses like 1,000 furious kettles. The air is thick with coal dust, and a child is crying into a bonnet that smells like mutton. A man shouts something unintelligible about Bristol. You nod as if that helps. This is train travel, Victorian style. You've made it. You follow the crowd with the same confidence as a sheep heading into a thunderstorm. There are signs, yes, but they're helpfully printed in fonts that appear to actively hate your eyes. Eventually you find a porter, a man who may or may not have ever lifted luggage before, and hand off your single precious trunk. He attaches a small tag that you're fairly certain says good luck in Latin. Off it goes. The train itself is a miracle of engineering, which is to say, it's long, loud, and smells like someone tried to roast a chimney. You don't so much climb aboard as clamber, tripping slightly over your own dignity and the edge of the platform. There is no gangway, no smooth glide, just a small wooden step that mocks your knees. Inside, the carriage is what a child might draw if asked to sketch transportation discomfort. Two benches face each other, upholstered in something that might once have been velvet but is now just a cautionary tale. There's a stove bolted into the centre of the floor, radiating uneven heat and a smell reminiscent of singed boot polish. Sit too close and you'll cook like a Sunday roast. Sit too far and you'll freeze into a tragic anecdote. You take your seat across from a man who nods, then sneezes directly into his glove. You nod back as etiquette demands and begin the silent mutual agreement to never make eye contact again. The compartment door closes with a finality that says, "You're not getting out of here until God says so." Moments later, the train lurches into motion, not so much a graceful departure as a violent suggestion. Your teeth chatter, your spine jolts. Somewhere behind you, a suitcase topples with the dramatic flair of a fainting aristocrat. And then, just like that, you're moving. Faster than you've ever moved in your life. Trees blur past. Fields turn into streaks of green and brown. A startled cow watches you vanish at 30 miles per hour, a speed so unfathomable to your ancestors they would have called it sorcery. You grip the seat as your stomach lags behind by about 3 minutes. At first, it's exhilarating. Then it's odd. There's something disorienting about this kind of speed. Not fast enough to feel like flying, but fast enough to make you wonder if your organs are still in the right places. The motion is constant. The vibrations are subtle but relentless. It's as if the entire carriage is humming a low, anxious note in your bones. You try to read a book. The letters jitter. You try to sip tea. The cup leaps into your lap like a suicidal squirrel. You realise now that train travel isn't just physically jarring, it's psychologically disarming. Before this, travel meant walking or sitting behind a horse. Something slow, plodding, rhythmic. Something your mind could process. But this is time travel with splinters. You're hurtling towards somewhere you've never seen, past everything you'll never understand, and it all feels vaguely unnatural. The man across from you begins to shift. His eyes dart. His hand trembles. You try not to notice because surely he's just tired. Maybe seasick. Maybe He stands up suddenly and shouts something incoherent about air and tunnels. His hat flies off. He begins unbuttoning his waistcoat. Your first instinct is concern. Your second is to press yourself as far into the window as possible and hope the train eats him before he eats you. Congratulations. You may have just witnessed your first case of railway madness, a condition the newspapers are calling real, and the medical men are pretending they've studied. You have no way of alerting the conductor. No way of unlocking the door, no corridor, no escape. Just you and a man currently muttering to the stove about vibrations and Judgment Day. And this, you realise, is only the beginning of the journey. You stay perfectly still, as if movement might trigger him. He's now taken off his boots and placed them solemnly on the bench like offerings. He hums. You don't recognise the tune. It might not be from this plane of existence. The train rocks gently, side to side, as if encouraging this descent into madness. Outside, the scenery is a blur of hedges and telegraph poles. Inside, it's sweat, confusion, and that specific Victorian blend of silence and panic. You wonder what's wrong with him, or rather, what's wrong with everyone on this train, including yourself. Because here's the thing no one warned you about. The movement never stops. The motion is constant, like being gently shaken by a very nervous god. Your muscles are tensed, even when you don't realise it. Your jaws clenched. Your temples buzz. You think, at first, it's your imagination, but then you remember the newspaper articles. The ones about men who stepped onto a train perfectly sane, and stepped off, convinced their reflection was trying to kill them. They called it railway psychosis. It sounded made up. Now it sounds a lot like what's happening in real time, as your compartment companion recites a list of sins that includes buttons and the number 4. Doctors blamed all sorts of things. The lack of oxygen in tunnels, the air pressure changes, the rhythmic grinding of metal wheels, the sheer unnatural speed. Some claimed the body wasn't designed to go faster than a galloping horse. Others believed it was the vibrations, that the shaking of the carriage irritated the nervous system until something in your brain snapped like a badly packed valise. You try to distract yourself. You read a pamphlet. The words bounce. You try to close your eyes. The man starts singing. You try to breathe deeply, but that's a mistake, because the air is a pungent cocktail of burning coal, damp wool, and something faintly medicinal, like a haunted apothecary. The man sits down again, quiet, watching you now. You nod politely as if to say, "I accept your insanity and wish you well." He smiles. That's worse. There's no getting off the train, not until the next station, and that won't be for another hour. You think about pulling the emergency cord, but there isn't one. That won't exist for another few decades, when someone finally realises that locking strangers together in a moving wooden box with no means of communication might be a bad idea. You consider knocking on the window, but it's a sealed carriage, and besides, no one would hear you over the sound of mechanical groaning and the scream whistle that blasts every 5 minutes like a ghost shouting "good luck." Eventually your companion dozes off, or dies. You don't check. You lean against the glass and pray for a tunnel, not because you want to go through it, but because tunnels mean towns, and towns mean stations, and stations mean the chance to escape. Except, tunnels have their own reputation, don't they? They're where the real danger lies, or so the newspapers say. The moment the lights go out, every man becomes a scoundrel, and every woman must defend her honour with a hatpin and prayer. Crimes of all sorts, gropings, thefts, even murder. They say you should never sit alone in a compartment with a stranger. But what if the only stranger is you by the time you exit the tunnel? Darkness has a way of unearthing things. Things like despair, or trench foot, or a powerful desire to jump out the window and just walk home. And yet, this is progress. This is modernity. This is what your taxes and your knees have paid for. You're not slogging along a muddy road behind a farting horse anymore. You're flying across the country in style, at 30 miles an hour, while hallucinating mildly and losing circulation in your left foot. When the train finally stops, you almost cry from the relief. Doors unlatch, air returns, the madman exits, barefoot and humming. You don't follow immediately. You sit for a moment, alone, trying to remember what your name is, or what year it is, or whether anyone warned you that this was what the future would feel like. Then you step out onto the platform, knees trembling, lungs grateful, brain rattling like a spoon in a teacup. You've survived your first true Victorian rail journey, and now you have 10 minutes to find food, use a toilet that may or may not exist, and board a different moving wooden box before it leaves without you. Because if you think the ride was rough, just wait until you try eating soup and sprinting in corset-laced trousers on a 10-minute station stop. In the early 19th century, the average British traveller had two options: walk, or ride something that wished it were dead. A journey from London to Edinburgh took 10 days on foot, or 3 days if you were lucky enough to endure the spine-cracking grandeur of a stagecoach, which offered all the comfort of a violently rattling cupboard dragged through mud by 4 resentful horses. This was not romantic. This was survival. Then came steam. By the 1820s, engineers began whispering heresy that humans might soon move faster than nature intended. What began as a tool for hauling coal, heavy, grimy, indispensable coal, quickly became something else, a new kind of movement, not just industrial, but existential. And by the 1830s, railways had burst out of the mines and into the cities like a mechanical revolution on wheels. At first, no one thought to use them for passengers. Why would you want to be flung through the countryside in a converted coal truck? But people began hopping onto the wagons anyway, literally, sitting on heaps of coal, paying a few pennies for the thrill of arriving dirty, bruised, and 90% deaf. Railway owners saw an opportunity. If people were willing to pay for that, imagine what they'd pay for actual benches. So, they added them. The first passenger carriages were wooden boxes on wheels with stiff benches and no roofs. If it rained, you got wet. If it snowed, you froze. If it was sunny, you baked. Still, they were faster than anything else, and that was the point. In a single lifetime, travel times were slashed from days to hours. Trains didn't just get you there faster. They redefined what there even meant. But building the network, that was a different kind of madness. Britain's landscape, so poetically green and pleasant, suddenly found itself being gouged, tunnelled and viaducted into submission. Steam locomotives don't do hills, they don't like curves, and they absolutely do not tolerate inefficiency. The railways needed to be flat, direct, and devastatingly precise. If nature didn't comply, it was removed. Enter the navvies, short for navigators, but not the seafaring kind. These were men who dug canals before steam came along, and who now found themselves summoned to the nation's newest obsession. Tracks. There were thousands of them, tens of thousands. At the peak, 250,000 navvies crisscrossed the country, carving the earth with picks and shovels like an army of half-drunk, soot-streaked ants. They built the railways by hand. No machines, no power tools, just raw muscle, reinforced by boiled beef and 9 pints of beer a day. Their camps moved with the line, makeshift villages springing up overnight, full of tents, livestock, mud, and moral ambiguity. There were fights, there were floods, there were injuries so grotesque they made surgeons weep. But the navvies endured, because the pay was better than farming, and the ale flowed constantly. Sleepers, rails, bridges, everything had to be made from scratch. They felled forests, hacked stone, and dragged beams up hills so steep it gave gravity second thoughts. The best wood for sleepers was oak, but Britain had long since chopped down most of its forests for ships, fences, and regrettable furniture. So, the railways turned to imports, especially from North America, where trees were still blissfully unaware of their fate. Every mile of track required about 2,000 sleepers. Multiply that by 20,000 miles of railway laid by the turn of the century, and you get numbers that make entire forests flinch. And then there was the ballast. Crushed stone packed beneath the rails to absorb shock, prevent rot, and keep the whole contraption from flying into a ditch every time it rained. It had to be hard, angular, and endlessly replaceable. So men were sent to quarries, hammers in hand, to smash rocks for hours on end. When steam-powered crushers arrived, they were seen as divine intervention, loud, dangerous, and glorious. By the 1840s, the railway boom had reached fever pitch. Towns grew around stations. Cities were connected for the first time in history. The population of Manchester doubled. Glasgow exploded. London became something entirely new. People no longer lived their whole lives within 30 miles of their birthplace. The world had expanded, shrunk, and sped up. All at once. And yet, for all this change, the methods were still incredibly primitive. Water-powered sawmills cut timber. Blacksmiths forged bolts one at a time. Every element of the railway, from the iron coach screws to the horsehair upholstery, was crafted with a blend of medieval labour and industrial ambition. And the pressure to build more lines, faster, meant corners were sometimes cut in places where corners should absolutely not be cut, like tunnels, or bridges, or the brakes. But people didn't seem to mind. In fact, they lined up in droves. Rail travel had transformed from an expensive novelty into a societal necessity, and more than that, a kind of national identity. The train was the symbol of progress, of the future, of your place in a rapidly evolving country that suddenly demanded to know, are you going somewhere? And if not, why? And so you go. You pack your bag, grip your ticket and step onto the platform, because if the train can carry coal, it can carry people. And if it can carry people, maybe it can carry you somewhere better. Even if that somewhere is just the third-class car right behind the stove, squinting through soot at a woman in lace gloves who smells like superiority and mothballs. Because up next, you're going to find out just how many types of comfort the Victorians could offer, depending entirely on how much money you brought and what kind of person society decided you were. You step into the third-class carriage and immediately regret every life choice that led you here. It's essentially a barn on wheels. There's no padding, no heating, and the breeze coming through the open slats has the sharpness of a personal insult. Your bench is wooden. Your neighbours are coughing in Morse code. Someone brought a chicken. You wonder what first class must be like. You've heard rumours, plush seats, real carpets, maybe even a pot of tea. They say first-class passengers travel in relative silence, disturbed only by the occasional newspaper rustle or the soft creak of expensive judgment. Some compartments are so private you can pretend your fellow passengers don't exist, unless one of them turns out to be the kind of man who removes his shoes and starts whispering to the luggage rack. Meanwhile, here in third class, you're being treated like highly flammable freight. There's a small stove near the centre of the carriage, which promises to either freeze you to death or roast your shins like mutton. The air is thick with soot, the windows are essentially decorative, and the man beside you has taken his shoes off to reveal a scent best described as historically significant. And yet, you're not on foot. You're not trudging through sleet or climbing hills with a donkey and an ulcer. You're going 30 miles an hour, and even if your dignity is in tatters, your boots remain dry. Mostly. Up ahead, the second-class carriage is a slight improvement. There's a roof. There are seats with something approaching cushioning. You may still be coughing up soot, but at least you're doing it in relative comfort. Second class is where the aspiring middle class travels. The clerks, the respectable tradesmen, the families on holiday. It's not luxury, but it's survivable. And then there's first class. You don't see it, but you can imagine it. Velvet upholstery, polished wood, a separate compartment for ladies so they don't have to witness men doing things like eating or breathing. If you're especially lucky and wealthy, you might be in a Pullman car, where servants named George will tend to your every need and gently ignore your drunken ramblings. The class system on Victorian trains isn't just a reflection of social status, it is the social status, pressed into wood, metal and upholstery. Every element of your journey is determined by your place in the hierarchy. Where you sit, what you see, who you speak to, and what you're allowed to smell. Even the railcar design enforces the divide. Third class is packed with benches and bodies, offering all the privacy of a sheep pen during market season. Second class is quieter, more orderly. First class, that's a whole other species. Enclosed compartments, panelled walls, perhaps even a curtain to separate you from your own moral decay. Women in particular were shuffled about according to both class and delicacy. In first class they had female-only compartments, delicate lighting, and an unspoken rule that no one mention anything unseemly, such as weather or biology. In third class women sat where they could, among men, families, crying children, chickens, their safety dependent on proximity to the nearest sensible old lady, or brave 12-year-old. Passengers of colour, when allowed aboard, were often forced into separate or substandard cars, if not outright refused service. In rural areas where it was too inconvenient to segregate, some white passengers simply had to cope with the horror of breathing the same air as everyone else. Editorials were written, fans were clutched, even the luggage got the class treatment. First-class passengers had their trunks neatly stowed by porters in fine uniforms. Third-class passengers handed theirs off to whichever overworked man happened to have an empty cart, if he didn't drop it in a puddle or send it to Wales by accident. Complaints abounded. Negligent baggage boys, one writer noted, have the moral constitution of a fox in a poultry shed. And yes, it was possible, and frequent, to get stuck in the wrong car. If you bought the cheapest ticket at the last second, or boarded in the wrong town, you might find yourself riding in what was technically a goods wagon. This was not uncommon. Passengers squatted on crates, shivered beside barrels, or huddled under tarps. One writer in 1850 described it as being transported not with, but as cargo. But slowly, reforms began to trickle in. The Railway Regulation Act of 1844 required that all passengers, regardless of class, be protected from the weather. That's right. Third-class passengers were finally legally entitled to a roof. Progress. And if you had enough money, or influence, the ride could be downright elegant. The Pullman company brought the idea of travelling in a style. Sleeper cars, dining cars, carpets, glass, china, and staff who would bring you water, turn down your bed, and politely ignore whatever embarrassing habits you brought aboard. Of course, those Pullman cars were staffed almost entirely by black porters, many of whom were required to answer to George, regardless of their real names. They worked long hours for low pay, endured racism and exhaustion, and yet provided the backbone of luxury train travel. Later, they would become some of the earliest and most influential labour organisers in American history. But all that's ahead of you. For now, you're sitting in a rocking wooden box pressed between a snoring tanner and a woman knitting something large and suspicious. A hot coal from the stove just landed on your shoe. Someone has released an onion from their luggage, and in 10 minutes you'll be leaping off this train, possibly while it's still moving, in search of food, a functioning toilet, and a reason not to board again. Because when the train stops, the clock starts, and nothing tests your Victorian resolve quite like sprinting across a muddy platform with a full bladder and half a sausage roll. You hit the platform at a speed somewhere between desperate and ungainly. Your boots land with a wet slap, your hat almost flies off, and your bag swings wildly, nearly decapitating a child holding a boiled egg. You're off the train, but now the real game begins, the race against the station clock. You have, according to the schedule and the conductor who barked it like a curse, exactly 8 minutes. 8 minutes to find a lavatory, buy food, stretch your legs, breathe non-coal-infused air, and somehow not miss the train when it begins moving again with all the subtlety of a cannon blast. The lavatory is your first target. You find a sign. It points confidently in one direction, and then disappears entirely. You run past a man chewing tobacco, a woman fanning herself into unconsciousness, and at least 2 unsupervised goats. Finally, you spot the door. It has a queue. Of course it does. The interior is, well, it exists. There's a toilet, technically. It's porcelain, maybe. The smell is what you'd expect if someone had attempted to sanitize a graveyard using soup. You do what you must, with the speed and grace of a prisoner evading capture, and then bolt back out into the station with 5 minutes to go. Next, food. You don't need a meal, you need sustenance. Something solid, something fast, something not currently growing mould. You locate the refreshment room by following the scent of scorched soup and mild despair. Inside is a counter, a woman in a stiff apron, and a large stack of meat pies that look suspiciously like they were made during the Crimean War. You order soup. You do not say, "May I please have a basin of soup?" You say, "soup." That's what the guidebook says. One word, one syllable. No time for pleasantries. She hands it to you in a dish as shallow as your faith in the rail system. You sip it while jogging back toward the train, burning your tongue and wondering if meat was ever actually involved in its creation. A bell rings. Your heart leaps into your throat. You drop the spoon and sprint. People are already boarding. Luggage is being hurled. A man is shouting about a missing umbrella. You make it to your car just as the wheels groan into motion. You grab the handle, leap aboard and collapse into your seat, sweaty, victorious, and clutching a meat pie like it's the Holy Grail. You made it, barely. But for many Victorian passengers, station stops weren't just frantic interludes. They were survival checkpoints. In the early days, trains had no bathrooms at all. None. If nature called mid-journey, the answer was either hold it or become a cautionary tale. You waited until the next station, and you made it fast. Or you didn't make it at all. When lavatories finally were introduced, they were charmingly referred to as hopper toilets, which is a gentle euphemism for a literal hole in the floor. Waste dropped straight onto the tracks. This was not discreet. This was not hygienic. This was not something you discussed in polite society, even as you did it. Eventually signs were posted instructing passengers not to use the hopper while the train was stationary at stations, which only tells you how often people did exactly that. For wealthier passengers, separate compartments offered a bit more dignity. Ladies' retiring rooms at stations became standard. spaces where respectable women could freshen up, fan themselves, and pretend the last 4 hours hadn't happened. First-class carriages had private toilets by the late 1800s, while second and third class lagged behind, often relying on station facilities for any and all basic needs. This made the refreshment room a vital battlefield. The food, of course, was not good. Travellers complained constantly. The soup was watery, the meat suspicious, the bread dry enough to be used in construction. And yet, it sold. Because the clock didn't care. You had 10 minutes to either choke down a grey sausage roll or go hungry until the next stop, which might be hours away, assuming your train didn't hit a cow or explode. Some stations developed reputations for lavish dining, elaborate spreads served with silver forks and stern glares. Others became infamous for charging outrageous sums for lukewarm beef and rock-hard buns. Railway companies were locked in competition, not just for passengers, but for their stomachs. A station with good food became a marketing tool. A station with bad food became a punchline. And if you didn't want to buy food, you could try your luck with what you brought, assuming it survived the heat, motion, and gradual transformation into jam-smeared pulp. Sandwiches were popular. So were boiled eggs. So were flasks of questionable homemade spirits that doubled as social lubricant and disinfectant. Then there was the toilet basket, an innocent-looking woven box carried by women who, travelling alone, might not have time to reach a proper lavatory. Inside, a chamber pot, artfully disguised among handkerchiefs, spare gloves, and the quiet shame of a society that refused to install adequate plumbing. It wasn't until the early 20th century that corridor cars became common, finally allowing passengers to walk to a lavatory mid-journey instead of praying for a timely stop. Dining cars followed, offering hot meals, table service, and the exhilarating possibility of not eating next to a crying baby or a box of live pigeons. But that's still decades away. For now you sit on your wooden bench, pie crumbs on your coat, mouth still tingling from soup heat, bladder semi-relieved, and soul slightly shaken. The train is moving again. The stove is glowing. The compartment air is thick with onion, tobacco, and the shared breath of strangers. And somewhere behind you, a man is removing his gloves and offering to play cards, which might not sound ominous yet, but trust us, it's the first sign that something very Victorian and very criminal is about to unfold. You try to ignore him. He smiles, a little too wide, and taps a deck of cards against his palm like someone practicing for mischief. You shake your head. He shrugs and slips them back into his coat pocket, right next to what you hope is a flask and not a revolver. You shift slightly, pulling your coat closer. Outside the window, the sun is dipping low. The fields blur into silhouettes. The light in the compartment flickers. You realise, with an internal sigh, that you're entering a tunnel. Of course you are. The carriage darkens. The soft clatter of the wheels becomes louder, almost rhythmic, like a countdown. You can't see much beyond your knees. That's fine. You didn't really want to look at the other passengers anyway. One of them might be looking back with too much interest. You remember what the travel guide said. Don't speak to strangers. Don't play cards. Don't go through tunnels alone if you can help it. Don't, whatever you do, let your guard down. The woman across from you fumbles for her handbag. She pulls out something long and sharp. A hat pin. She holds it in her lap, casual as can be. You do the same with your umbrella, even though it's been broken since Swindon. Because in the dark, everyone's a suspect. Victorian society may have been obsessed with propriety and elegance, but it was equally obsessed with scandal, crime, and the notion that danger was lurking just out of sight. Ideally behind a curtain, inside a compartment, or around the next bend in the track, and the railways delivered. They didn't just connect cities, they connected crime scenes. From the 1840s onward, newspapers practically feasted on the rising tide of railway misbehaviour. Robberies, assaults, indecencies, brawls, and, most sensational of all, murders in transit. In December 1860, one such case gripped Paris. A train from Mulhouse arrived at its station on time. The passengers disembarked, all except one. When the conductor finally opened the locked compartment, he found Chief Justice Poinsot lying on the floor in a pool of blood. His fellow traveller was missing. The press went mad. Speculation exploded. Rumours swirled that the killer had leapt off the train mid-motion or disguised himself as a ticket inspector. Public panic surged. New protocols were demanded, locks were re-evaluated, But the damage was done, and the legend had begun. Britain followed suit with its own compartment horror. A murder near London in the 1860s prompted a House of Commons report that fretted over the rise of railway imprisonment, the terrifying reality that passengers were trapped in private compartments with no way to escape, no corridor to flee through, and no emergency cord to yank. If your travelling companion went from quiet gentleman to blood-soaked lunatic, you had two options: defend yourself with whatever improvised weaponry was available, or pray the train reached its next stop before you reached your end. Railway psychosis became a buzzword, a medical curiosity and a convenient legal defence. Men who otherwise seemed perfectly sane were said to snap the moment the wheels began to turn. The constant vibration, the dim lights, the pressure of confinement, it all added up to temporary madness. In some cases they attacked others, in others, themselves. One man tried to strangle his own reflection in the window. Another jumped from a moving train convinced it was a trap. Newspapers devoured these stories. The illustrated police news in particular turned real crimes into lurid cartoons. Madman attacks lady with chamber pot on Brighton line, and the public ate it up. Train travel, once thrilling, now came with a thrill of a different kind: fear. Not all crime involved violence, of course. Some of it was merely creative theft. The isolated nature of compartments made them perfect for card sharks, pickpockets, and confidence men. One scam involved pretending to be drunk and obnoxious, the kind of fellow everyone wanted to humiliate. He'd offer a game of cards, lose spectacularly, encourage bigger bets, and then suddenly he'd win it all back, sometimes with sleight of hand, sometimes with an accomplice in the next carriage. Some passengers, desperate to reclaim their winnings, would continue gambling all the way to financial ruin. Others would complain, only to be told that playing cards with strangers in a railway compartment was very much not advised, and that they had only themselves to blame, which, to be fair, was the Victorian solution to most problems. Then there were the robberies. Especially as the railroads pushed westward across the American continent, trains became moving targets for outlaws, who'd stop them mid-journey, raid the express car, and vanish into the night with bags of cash, mail, and sometimes hostages. Gangs like the James brothers became folk heroes, seen by some as sticking it to the railway tycoons who were rich, smug, and notoriously stingy with their passenger safety investments. To be fair, the express car often carried more wealth than some banks: gold, bonds, payrolls, all travelling through empty landscapes, guarded by one man with a pistol and very little sense of self-preservation. The robbers came prepared, the railways often did not, and still the trains rolled on. The rail companies responded by hiring guards, building stronger compartments, and eventually adding corridors, attendants, and emergency signalling systems. But the damage and the romance was already in place. Train travel wasn't just about reaching your destination. It was a gamble, a drama, a journey into the unknown. Back in your carriage, the tunnel ends. Light returns. The card-playing gentleman has disappeared into another compartment. The woman with the hat pin smiles and tucks it back into her sleeve. Outside the window, trees blur past like they've seen things they'll never speak of. You exhale, but not for long, because the next car on the train, that's the Pullman sleeper. And if you thought crime and claustrophobia were intense, wait until you experience a whole new type of railway hierarchy, one where luxury is measured in robe length, porters named George, and whether or not your chamber pot comes with silver trim. You open the door and step into another world. Gone are the wooden benches, the coughing men, and the faint but persistent smell of boiled onion and moral decay. In their place, velvet curtains, polished mahogany, a soft clatter underfoot like civilized thunder. You've entered the Pullman sleeper, and for the first time all day you feel like a human being again, or at least an aristocrat impersonator with a valid ticket. There's carpet on the floor, actual carpet, not straw, not boards, carpet. It whispers beneath your shoes like it's seen things and promised not to tell. The uniformed porter greets you with a nod. His name is George. All Pullman porters are named George. It saves confusion and ensures that any complaint can be shouted confidently down the corridor without risking a misfire. George takes your coat, your valise, and most of your remaining sense of class insecurity. You are led to your berth, which is not just a bench, it's a room, with curtains, a lamp, a proper bed folded into the wall, there's a basin with a jug of lukewarm water, a bell to summon help, a robe that smells faintly of starch and ambition. You put it on and immediately feel respectable. There's something intoxicating about this kind of elegance, especially after 8 hours of soot inhalation and meat pie regret. You sit on the edge of the bed, unsure if you're supposed to feel grateful or slightly guilty. You decide on both. Victorian travel was never about comfort. It was about hierarchy dressed in lace and varnish. And tonight, for once, you're at the top. Dinner is announced with a chime. You follow it down the corridor to the dining car, where gaslight flickers on polished brass and the entire place smells like soup and expectation. You're seated at a white-clothed table beside a man reading the Times and a woman who refuses to acknowledge anyone who hasn't been formally presented to the Queen. The menu is handwritten. The waiter is pale with tension. You order the roast beef not because you want it, but because it seems like the safest choice. It arrives in slices too thin to be criminal, served with potatoes and something green that might be a vegetable or an aggressive garnish. You eat slowly. You drink cautiously. The train rocks gently. The silver clinks. And for a moment you pretend this is all normal. That this is how travel should be. That you belong here. But luxury on a moving train is a delicate illusion. Behind the curtains and cutlery, reality hums like the engine that pulls you forward. The sleeping berths, for example, are marvels of design and claustrophobia. During the day they fold into elegant sofas. At night they unfold into narrow beds so close together you can hear the dreams of the man across the aisle. Privacy is a matter of curtain etiquette. Soundproofing is a fantasy. You learn quickly that people snore, whisper, mutter, and occasionally curse in their sleep. Someone's boots clatter to the floor at 1 a.m. Someone else appears to be sleep-eating crackers. And the toilets? Well, the Pullman does offer one, singular, at the far end of the car. Getting to it involves a midnight shuffle down a lurching hallway in a robe and slippers while attempting to maintain dignity and bladder control. You pass a mirror and catch a glimpse of yourself. Wild hair, hollow eyes, and a face that says moderately haunted. Still, the robe makes it work. Sleep when it arrives is not restful. The motion of the train is soothing in theory, like a cradle or a very large animal deciding not to eat you. But then the whistle sounds, the brakes engage, the train jolts, and you wake up in a half panic, unsure if it's morning or the apocalypse, and yet there's something magical about it. You're miles away from where you started. The train carried you through towns, fields, tunnels, and time zones, while you lay swaddled in wool and hope. You rise at dawn, bleary-eyed and brave, to find tea waiting on a silver tray. George appears as if summoned to ask whether you'd like your boots blackened. You say yes. Because you've come this far. Because you're pretending to be someone who expects their boots to gleam. Because for one night the train didn't just take you somewhere, it let you be someone else. And yet, as you dress and sip tea and smooth your hair into a shape that suggests you didn't sleep with your head in a drawer, you hear something from up ahead. A screech, a sudden jolt, a shuddering halt. You brace yourself. Because while luxury may soften the journey, it does nothing for what happens when a Victorian train hits something that shouldn't be there. The train shudders once, then again, harder, and everything tilts just enough to suggest that the laws of physics are considering a mutiny. You spill your tea, it arcs gracefully through the air and lands on your shoe with the precision of a vengeful ghost. In the hallway, someone yelps. In the next compartment, a suitcase topples with the distinctive sound of someone's entire wardrobe dying. And then, silence. The train has stopped. Not slowed, not paused. Stopped. Completely. You sit still for a moment, heart tapping out Morse code against your ribs, robe belt clutched like a lifeline. You listen. No whistle. No footfalls. No helpful announcement. Just the soft creak of cooling metal and the quiet realization that something has gone very, very wrong. Eventually someone opens the door. It's George, still composed but now carrying the faint expression of a man who has seen a goat on the tracks before. He says something about a slight obstruction and disappears before anyone can ask what exactly was obstructing and whether it had a name, a pulse, or horns. You glance out the window. Fields. Just endless, damp British countryside, some trees, a fence, a cow. The cow is looking directly at you. You don't know what it wants, but its expression suggests that you've ruined its afternoon. Welcome to the worst-case scenario of Victorian rail travel. Unexpected countryside immobilisation. You disembark with a handful of other passengers, hopping down from the carriage like stunned refugees from a collapsing opera. The gravel crunches underfoot. It's cold. Someone is already arguing about compensation. Someone else is asking if they'll still be on time for the luncheon in Bath. You want to ask if trains can be haunted. You don't. Because the truth is, this sort of thing happened more than you'd think. Victorian trains, while revolutionary, were also prone to an extraordinary number of breakdowns, derailments, and full-blown accidents. Sometimes it was livestock on the tracks, sometimes it was a faulty coupling, and sometimes, thrillingly, the issue was that the brakes simply gave up. The engineering of the time was ambitious but brittle. Trains ran hot, boilers burst, axles cracked, switches failed. Wooden carriages, bolted together with more optimism than structural integrity, could, and did, fly apart like exploded wardrobes during sudden stops, especially in poor weather, especially on older lines, especially when someone important needed to arrive on time and the schedule took priority over things like not dying. Some incidents were minor, others were catastrophic. The Clayton Tunnel crash of 1861 involved 2 trains entering the same tunnel thanks to poor communication and one very nervous signalman. Nearly 24 people died, hundreds more were injured. Newspapers responded by calling tunnels death traps, and readers responded by folding their morning papers and booking another journey anyway. And yet, despite the danger, the system kept expanding, because the railways were essential, even if they were also deeply cursed by sheep. Yes, sheep, and pigs, and cows. Livestock on the tracks caused delays, derailments, and moral arguments. Who was to blame when a train hit a sheep? The farmer, the company, the sheep. Cases went to court. Compensation was calculated based on the value of the animal, and in some cases the presumed emotional distress of the passengers who had to sit in a field for 3 hours next to a very flat goat. To manage the chaos, rail companies employed track walkers, men who walked miles of line daily to check for obstructions, cracks, or sabotage. They carried lanterns, hammers, and the constant awareness that they could be hit by a train at any moment. It was not a relaxing job. Signalling systems, such as the semaphore arm, were introduced to try and prevent these disasters, though they often relied on eyesight, intuition, and the hope that everyone was paying attention. Telegraphs helped, eventually. But in the early decades, much of rail safety boiled down to sheer luck and the personal competence of the man operating a lever in a wooden shed with frostbite. Back on your train, the porter reappears. He informs you that the obstruction has been removed. You don't ask for details. You don't want details. You simply reboard, shoes damp, robe flapping, dignity shredded like a ham sandwich in a hurricane. The train lurches forward again, slowly at first, as if testing the very concept of momentum. You exhale. You sit. And as the wheels begin their rhythmic chant, that familiar clatter, that metallic heartbeat, you realise that despite everything, you are still moving. You're still aboard. You're still going somewhere. Maybe not entirely intact, but then again, neither is Britain. Because railways didn't just change how people travelled, they changed where they lived, what they ate, what they wore. They reshaped landscapes, timelines, and tea schedules. They built empires, demolished villages, and left behind a legacy of soot, steel, and slightly traumatized passengers. And if you want to understand the Victorian world, really understand it, you have to ride it. Not the sanitized version, not the museum display, the real thing. A thundering, whistling, soup-splattering beast of iron and fire. And tomorrow, when you tell people what it was like, you'll say it was fast, it was terrifying, it was magnificent, and you'll leave out the part about the cow. By the time the train arrives at its final station, you've begun to understand something important. Not just about locomotion, or class or bladder control, though you've certainly learned about those, but about transformation. You haven't just moved across land, you've moved through time. Because this wasn't just a journey, it was a preview of everything to come. The Victorian Railway wasn't merely a transportation system, it was a national nervous system. A sprawling network of iron veins pumping people, parcels and possibilities across the body of a newly industrial Britain. And for all its smoke, stink and unpredictable livestock encounters, it worked. Miraculously. Madly. Often barely. but it worked. At its height, the British Railway stretched over 20,000 miles of track, crossing hills, diving through tunnels, and linking every factory, village, and fashionable luncheon point imaginable. Trains carried coal and corpses, letters and live chickens, soldiers and suffragettes, aristocrats in velvet and orphans in potato sacks. Everything and everyone moved, faster than ever before. Time itself warped. Before trains, local time was set by the sun. Noon in Bristol wasn't noon in London, but railways demanded precision, schedules, coordination, and so Greenwich Mean Time became the standard, not just for Britain, but eventually for the world. The railways didn't just shrink distance, they invented uniform time. Along the tracks grew new towns, built from scratch, their fortunes tied to the rhythm of arrivals and departures. Entire industries exploded. Tourism, mail-order catalogues, meat delivery, national newspapers. If it could be shipped, it could be sold. And if it could be sold, it could be bought in cities that had never seen such things before. The railway station itself became a new kind of cathedral. Grand arches, iron girders, stained glass, and barrel-vaulted ceilings that made passengers feel they weren't just travelling, they were ascending. You could board a train in a soot-streaked mining town and disembark in a London hotel with brass doorknobs and indoor plumbing. For a brief moment, the railway made upward mobility feel like something you could actually buy. But it wasn't all progress. As rail travel expanded, so did inequality. The trains may have democratised movement, but only within tightly regulated class compartments. The wealthy were protected, pampered, even perfumed. The poor were carried, but barely. They sat on wooden planks, breathed cinders, and were reminded with every jolt that their place in society was measured by where they sat on the train. Still they came, millions of them. By the end of the 19th century, train tickets were cheap enough that even a labourer could go on holiday. Seaside towns swelled. Picnics became a national pastime. Families visited relatives they'd only ever written to. The country became knowable, reachable, real, even if it was covered in coal dust and served with a lukewarm pie. The cultural imprint was enormous. Poets wrote odes to trains. Children played with toy locomotives. Sherlock Holmes pursued murderers on railways. Dickens had characters derailed by them, and once, tragically, experienced a rail crash himself that left him permanently shaken. Trains weren't just background noise. They were central characters in the story of the age. And while the golden age of steam eventually gave way to quieter, faster, cleaner methods of travel, something about those early journeys has never quite left us. You can still hear it in the distant whistle of a passing freight train. You can still feel it in the shudder of steel beneath your feet when you step onto an old platform. You can still see it in the arch of a forgotten viaduct, moss-covered and dignified. The Victorian Railway taught an entire empire what it meant to go somewhere, to leave, to arrive, to change. And for all the soot burns, the screaming infants, and the deeply suspicious pies, that was the real miracle, that you could sit in a rattling wooden box and emerge somewhere else, somewhere new, somewhere that hadn't existed for you until the train made it real. And maybe, just maybe, the next time you complain about delays on a modern train, no soot, no chickens, no madmen with hatchets, you'll remember your Victorian journey. You'll sip your coffee, tap your phone, and thank the universe that your shoes are dry, your car has a corridor, and the only goat you're likely to encounter is on your sandwich wrapper. The train changed everything, and then it did it again. The train didn't die with the Victorians, it just got rebranded. By the early 20th century, steam locomotives were still chugging away, but their gleam had dulled. Motor cars appeared, smug and private. Airplanes followed, faster and frighteningly aloft. And the once majestic Pullman cars became symbols of yesterday's ambition. Lovely to look at, impractical to operate, and expensive to maintain unless you were transporting oil barons or opera singers. The grand stations remained, for a while. Vast iron vaults, echoing with footsteps and announcements, housing ghosts and pigeons in roughly equal measure. Some became shopping centres, some were bulldozed. A few, with their Gothic arches and gaslight patina, were converted into museums of themselves, preserved in amber so tourists could walk through and say, "Wow, people really travelled like this?" Yes, they did. In 3 classes, no seatbelts, and with a ham sandwich wrapped in newspaper. But even as the railways declined, the romance never quite evaporated. Something about trains lodged itself in the collective psyche. Maybe it's the sound, that lonesome whistle. Maybe it's the rhythm, that steady clatter of wheels like a heartbeat stretched across a continent. Maybe it's just the sheer drama of it all. The departures, the reunions, the suitcases, the staring out windows at places you'll never set foot in. Victorian trains became metaphors. In novels, they carried lovers toward doom. In films, they carried spies toward secrets. In dreams, they carried us home. And then, almost inevitably, they circled back around again. By the late 20th century, nostalgia did what nostalgia always does. It cleaned the soot off history and called it vintage. Heritage railways sprang up across Britain, privately restored steam lines where tourists could ride in antique cars, sip lukewarm tea, and pretend they were escaping to Yorkshire in 1884, rather than circling a gift shop in 2023. The engines were real. The smells were authentic. The actors playing porters named George were probably named Dave, but that was part of the charm. Even railway dining made a strange, slow comeback. Where once the refreshment room served soup that tasted like regret, now you could eat duck à l'orange in a restored 1920s dining car, while someone in suspenders played ragtime on a portable phonograph. The irony being, of course, that modern rail passengers would now pay 10 times more for the privilege of discomfort, creaking suspension, and historically accurate indigestion. But nostalgia, like a misaligned coupling, can be dangerous. It's easy to forget that the golden age of trains was also the golden age of delay, derailment, class snobbery, and severe concussions. For every elegant journey in a velvet-lined Pullman, there were 100 bone-jarring rides in third-class wagons filled with frostbite and moral ambiguity. And yet we remember the good bits. The sound, the movement, the way the landscape unspools like a film reel outside your window, the way the stations feel like thresholds, not just between towns, but between chapters in a life. The feeling that maybe, if you get on the right train at the right time, everything might make sense by the time you get off. That's the true legacy of the Victorian Railway. Not just soot and steel, but momentum. The idea that the future was something you could reach, if you were brave enough to climb aboard, find your seat, and let the world blur past the window as you rock gently towards something new. No refunds, no guarantees, and absolutely no idea what's in the pie. And while the locomotives carried industry, empires, and ambition, they also carried people, ordinary ones, complicated ones, the kind with bread in their pockets and nowhere else to go. There's a child staring at you. He's about 6, has no shoes, and is clutching a piece of bread like it's a rare treasure. He's not with you. He's not with anyone. He just showed up at the last station and climbed aboard like it was expected of him. You nod politely, he nods back. You both understand the rules of third class, because trains weren't just for businessmen with monocles and ladies in lace gloves. They were for everyone, and everyone had a reason to board. Children were shipped across the country for schooling, for labour, or simply for relocation. Entire families migrated from countryside to city in search of factory work, packing their lives into one trunk and their dreams into the space between bench slats. Honeymooners rode the rails in shy silence, gripping each other's hands and pretending they weren't sharing a carriage with a retired butcher and a chicken in a basket. Photographs were sometimes taken on the platform before departure. Him in his hat, her in a new dress, both pretending this trip to Brighton was the beginning of something grand and not, statistically, a long road to mutual irritation, and 4 children named Alfred. And then there were the soldiers, boys barely shaving, dressed in red or khaki, headed to barracks or off to war. You could spot them instantly, the nervous laughter, the rough joking, the clutched telegram. Mothers waved from platforms too proud to cry. Some came back, some didn't. The trains carried both, the living and, all too often, the dead. Funeral trains were real, entire cars converted to carry coffins, especially during times of epidemic or battle. The dead had their own timetables. Some were buried far from home, others brought back with wreaths and whispered prayers. It wasn't dramatic, just quiet, efficient, unavoidable. And then there were those who travelled alone, not to arrive but to escape. Runaways, from families, from employers, from arranged marriages and poor decisions. The railways offered anonymity, and for a few shillings, a clean getaway. One girl boarded in disguise, dressed as a boy, hoping to vanish into Liverpool. A man rode in silence, leaving a scandal behind in Bath and reinventing himself somewhere near Hull. The train didn't ask questions, it just moved. And so did the passengers, a constant blur of purpose and fear, romance and finality. You glance again at the child. He's fallen asleep now, curled against the side of the bench like a dog in a hayloft. The train rocks him gently. He doesn't stir. No one else seems to know who he is. But the train carries him anyway. But while passengers came and went, fleeing, falling in love, or simply surviving, another group stayed behind. The ones who made the trains run, who kept the fires hot, the signals clear and the wheels turning no matter who was aboard. You hear the whistle, you think, that's nice. A soft, nostalgic wail, maybe even romantic. But to the man who blew it, it's not art. It's a signal, a scream, a deadline. Because behind every Victorian train was a battalion of men, and occasionally women, sweating, shouting, running, stoking, and hoping they lived through their shift. Let's start with the driver. He sits at the front, exposed to the elements, pulling levers like he's conducting a symphony with fire and oil. His hands are black. His face is black. His clothes are permanently stiff from soot. He watches the rails like a hawk and trusts the brakes like a man in a bad marriage. They work until they don't. Beside him, the fireman, a job that sounds noble but mostly involves shoveling hell into a furnace. He burns through literal tons of coal per trip, stripped to the waist and gleaming with soot-slick sweat. Barely speaking, occasionally yelling something about pressure or death. His back is wrecked by age 30. His lungs don't make it to 50. At the rear, there's the guard. Not a security guard, but more like a conductor, a dispatcher, and an anxious father figure rolled into one. He checks tickets. He times stops. He writes frantic logs in pencil while the train sways like a drunk donkey. If something goes wrong, he's the one who gets blamed, usually by passengers, sometimes by management, occasionally by fate. And then there's the porter. You've met him. His name is George. He lifts bags, herds tourists, and fetches hot water for people who will absolutely not tip him. He smiles anyway. He's underpaid, overworked, and often black, especially on the luxury Pullman lines, where his uniform is pristine, his manners impeccable, and his personal dignity expected to absorb decades of casual racism without cracking. Farther afield, in the huts and towers and isolated outposts, sit the signalmen. They control traffic using levers, bells, and the ancient art of not blinking. They don't get lunch breaks. If they miss a signal, people die. Their entire existence is a blend of chess, algebra, and tea, with a healthy splash of existential dread. None of these people are rich. None are thanked in travel guides. But without them, the train doesn't move, the engine doesn't fire, the platform remains a dream. They are the heartbeat of the railway. You just happen to be the passenger. And just as those men kept the engines alive, the trains themselves carried more than people. They hauled everything a restless empire could throw on board, from letters and livestock to luggage, organs, and the occasional elephant. Your suitcase didn't arrive. You stand on the platform surrounded by other confused travellers and a flock of geese in cages, and realise something horrifying. Your valise, containing all your underthings and the good gloves, is somewhere near Wolverhampton. But you're not alone. Victorian trains didn't just carry people, they carried everything. Luggage was the obvious bit. Trunks, satchels, hat boxes, wicker baskets, mysterious bags that clanked suspiciously. Porters stacked them with all the finesse of a reverse game of Jenga, and if something got misrouted to the wrong town, well, that's what telegrams were for. But then there were the letters, hundreds of thousands of them. Mail trains ran constantly, fast, precise, and loaded with everything from love notes to eviction notices. Postmen sorted them en route, flicking envelopes into slots while the car lurched over bridges. It was a miracle of logistics and back pain, and it made Britain's mail system the envy of the world. And the livestock. Oh, the livestock. Chickens in crates. Pigs in pens. A very famous goat named William who once escaped his enclosure and spent 2 hours terrorising a third-class compartment somewhere outside Oxford. Horses had their own cars, so did racing dogs. Sometimes people rode alongside their animals. Other times they simply prayed they'd arrive intact and in the right county. The railways also transported corpses. Funeral cars were discreet but common. Bodies were embalmed, boxed and logged with solemn paperwork. If you rode long enough and asked the right porter, he'd tell you which car was the quiet one. And then there were the odds and ends. Crates of books, barrels of ale, live eels, church organs, entire sets for travelling theatre companies, and one time, an elephant. Yes, an elephant, for a circus in Leeds. He was loaded in early and fed buns at every station. He trumpeted once, broke a window, and was otherwise an ideal passenger. The train was more than just a ride. It was a vein, pulsing with the full, messy contents of the empire. People, letters, pigs, secrets, suitcases, coffins, hopes. And one day, when you're back home, warm and still smelling faintly of soot, someone will ask how your trip was. You'll smile, and you'll say there was an elephant on board, but other than that, completely normal. But before we return to the comforts of today's clean stations and humming engines, we owe a moment to the silent army who made this journey possible. Not the men with titles, but the women and children who toiled in shadows, unseen and unpaid. You never saw them on the platform. They weren't pulling levers or shouting about coal. They were behind the doors marked staff only, tucked in smoky rooms and damp laundries, up at dawn and forgotten by noon. Victorian railways didn't run on steam alone. They ran on the blistered hands of washerwomen, the hunched backs of seamstresses, and the calloused feet of children barely old enough to spell locomotive. In the laundries, women scrubbed piles of sheets, uniforms, towels, curtains, all of it grey with soot and sticky with engine grease. Their soap burned the skin, the water scalded. They sang when they could and coughed when they couldn't, and when the station master's tablecloths needed extra starch, they stayed through the night. Nobody ever wrote about them in the travel brochures, but if the sheets in your sleeper car were crisp and clean, you had them to thank. The seamstresses stitched uniforms until their eyes blurred. Not glamorous military regalia, but the dull, navy blue work suits worn by guards and porters. They hemmed torn trousers, replaced buttons, reinforced the elbows that wore through from years of leaning out train doors. No one applauded the neatness of their stitches, but if a uniform split mid-shift, it was considered a disgrace. Men got warnings, women got nothing. And then there were the children, the smallest, cheapest cogs in the railway machine. They swept stations, cleaned carriages, hauled coal in buckets. One boy was so small he could crawl under moving trains to grease the axles, and did, daily. If he was crushed, someone else would be hired. Boys worked long before they grew into their boots. Girls too, when they weren't minding younger siblings or running errands for station staff. Every now and then, a child would fall asleep on a pile of sacks, miss a shift, and wake up unemployed. These weren't careers, they were necessities. Jobs taken when there was nothing else, kept because there was no choice. They earned pennies, they had no pensions, no plaques, just aching joints and sooty hands that shook when the train passed by. You never saw them in the compartments. You never sat beside them in first class, but every stitch in the curtains, every clean sheet, every hinge that didn't squeak, it was them. They were the steam behind the steam, and now, finally, we step off the platform, not in 1875, but today. The station smells different now. Less coal, more coffee. You don't hear horses or hat boxes or a man screaming about luggage injustice. You hear soft chimes, clean announcements, maybe a distant sigh about a signal delay. And when the train arrives, it glides in with barely a sound, doors opening like something from the future. Because it is. You step on board, no soot, no stoves, no screaming chickens. You sit. The seats are padded, the lights don't flicker, there's Wi-Fi. You roll through the countryside at 125 miles per hour and complain. Not because you're ungrateful, but because you've forgotten what it took to get here. But the train remembers. It remembers the navvies who smashed rock and bent rails with blistered hands, who built 20,000 miles of track with tools barely sharper than their tongues. It remembers the porters who lifted bags and bowed through insults, the signalmen who didn't blink, the firemen who shoveled hell into boilers so strangers could arrive on time. It remembers the children sleeping under coats, the soldiers writing last letters, the honeymooners in third class pretending they couldn't smell the goat. It remembers the broken brakes, the missing carriages, the heroic leaps, the missed stations, the lost limbs, the brass buttons polished before every departure. And now, here you are, scrolling your phone at 70 miles per hour, wondering if the trolley has oat milk. We didn't get here by accident. We got here by invention, by discomfort, by absurdity, by failure, by trying again. Every silent door, every digital ticket, every high-speed train owes something to a terrified Victorian woman sprinting across a platform with her corset half fastened and a pie in her pocket. So the next time your train is 5 minutes late, or the air conditioning is too cold, or the man across from you insists on eating cheese loudly, pause and say thank you. Because once upon a time someone had to ride a goat cart with a stove in the middle and a toilet that dropped straight onto the tracks, so you could sit here, in the future, going somewhere fast, and barely noticing the miracle of it. And now, as the last whistle fades into the fog and the station lamps flicker dim against the iron rails, I hope this slow ride through Victorian train travel has nestled into your thoughts, like a cinder caught in your collar, or a mystery left behind in a sleeping car. You've journeyed through smoke-filled compartments and clattering tracks, where every mile risked derailment and every arrival was a minor miracle. But now, it's time to rest. The engine cools, the lanterns dim, and for tonight, our train pulls gently into its final stop. If you're still awake, congratulations, you've survived another strange passage through history. Hit subscribe so we can board a new line to the past tomorrow night. And as you drift, the soft crackle of the fire will carry you deeper, away from the soot and the screeching brakes, and safely into sleep.